There's $200 million in the vault beneath the strip, with a 32-hour window to get it out. Find the safe. This should be a simple in and out.
Scott is one of a hardened group of survivors who made it out of Las Vegas after it fell to a zombie outbreak. But just a few years later, he's working as a fry cook when casino boss Tanaka offers him the heist of a lifetime. Sneak into Las Vegas before it's nuked and empty a vault of $200 million. Army of the Dead is the new film from cult director Zack Snyder. And it feels a bit strange calling him a cult director, I know, because he's so well known for blockbuster movies, these multi-million-dollar franchise films. But it feels strange to call him anything other than a cult director, because I don't think there's any other director alive who gets talked about as much on the internet by as vocal and occasionally as aggressive a fan base as Snyder's. And that's all, of course, to do with the Snyder Cut, the feeling that Snyder got robbed of the ability to do what he wanted to do with the DC universe. But before all of that, in fact before superheroes entirely, Snyder wrote a script as a proposed sequel to his 2004 Dawn of the Dead remake, and then Warner Brothers just sat on it for years and years, until 2019, when before the Snyder Cut was officially confirmed, Snyder got to make his zombie movie. It's also notable as being only the second original film that Snyder's made, one that isn't adapted from another IP. And I think the word original is doing a lot of heavy lifting there, because actually the idea of combining these zombie and heist movie genres together makes for quite a derivative film, albeit one that's very entertaining and has a distinctive visual style. And that's actually where I'd like to start with talking about this movie, because you really notice it right from the beginning moments. The film has this odd sort of creamy, very dreamy look to it, where it's all shot incredibly shallow, very little in focus, and what is in focus is pin sharp. And that's because it was predominantly shot on a lens known as the Canon Dream lens. It's a 50mm lens that has an f/0.95 aperture, which, if you know about cameras and lenses, means it's incredibly shallow. And all of this would have been especially at the forefront of Snyder's mind because he shot this movie. So he's not just the credited writer, director, and producer, but also the cinematographer on this film as well. Now, I don't think they use this lens on everything like they have slightly implied in the kind of publicity and the marketing around the film, because you can see in some of the behind the scenes stuff that there seems to be different lenses being used. But nevertheless, it is obviously used in several signature moments throughout the movie. In fact, this particular shot behind me, I'm pretty sure, was shot with that particular lens. And the end result of that technical mumbo jumbo is that it's got a very creamy look, by which I mean that it's relatively low contrast. It has kind of an oddly desaturated whites, so skin tones and kind of mid elements of the image are often quite desaturated, but the colors are very rich because of the way that the film footage itself has been treated. And so that, combined with these kind of rainbow lens flares and the aforementioned very shallow focus, really makes the film kind of dreamy and almost surreal looking. You get a very good look at that in the opening minutes of the film, which sees a US Army convoy transporting some sort of secret stuff, which turns out to be basically OG Zombie Patient Zero, and they are derailed by, let's say, an particularly poorly judged episode of vehicular oral. Once that zombie escapes, we get this lovely shot of him silhouetted against the bright lights of Vegas, and we realize he's going to head to the nearest population center and do his thing. And then there's a hard cut to a Liberace impersonator who talks to the camera for a second before starting to play the piano as people get eaten behind him. And that's the second thing I want to talk about, which is the really odd tone of this movie. Odd isn't necessarily a bad thing, it's just that there is a really weird mishmash of very dark humor, attempts to do kind of serious human character stuff and even touch on some political things, and then just this kind of like comic booky violence and gore. Being a Zack Snyder opening sequence, this is like a poppy montage set to a popular song, and it has lots and lots of slow motion in it, so for you Snyder purists, you'll be happy. And what we're looking at, set to a Richard Cheese cover, which again is another callback to Dawn of the Dead, the 2004 movie that very famously had a Richard Cheese musical montage in it. What we're seeing in this sequence is nothing less than the fall of Las Vegas. We see showgirls running around biting patrons on the casino floor with the slot machines. We see Elvis impersonators shambling around on the strip. If you've seen the trailer, you'll be familiar with the sequence because it's been very heavily featured in those videos. And then we start to get these survivor stories where we see characters who later become the main cast of the film kind of making their way out of Las Vegas. And sometimes these are intercut with those survivors holding a family photo and standing in front of a photographic backdrop, like one that's been properly rigged, like something that you would see at like school picture day or something, but it's been set up in the middle of this kind of smouldering wreckage, this bloody carnage. And then after all this kind of knockabout comedy meta stuff, there's a really sad, melancholic beat. And that's where the film's opening montage ends and Army of the Dead begins proper. So that gives you a really on-the-nose example of how odd the tone of the film can be. But when it works, I think it works really well. It's really singular. And the funny thing was, it reminded me of a particular franchise, probably because Las Vegas also features in an installment of that franchise, which is Fallout. Now, Fallout has that same thing where it's having these really dark little vignettes, but it's also touching them with these elements of almost absurd humor. And the closest I think that Army of the Dead gets to that exact tone is a moment when, later on, when they're in the strip, they find a load of bodies hanging from the ceiling. These people have obviously killed themselves to not be zombies, but they're all wearing glittery, late-era Elvis jumpsuits. So they're obviously a whole room full of Elvis impersonators who shut themselves away and decided they'd rather die than become zombies. Pretty tough idea, but kind of darkly gallows humor funny. And like I said, that's not always an easy tone to watch, and I think that the human drama elements of the film are probably the ones that suffer the most. Kind of like the stuff that really didn't work in Batman vs Superman, you know, the whole Martha thing, this parental drama stuff. But for what it's worth, it really does feel like a departure from the very doomy, gloomy, funereal, if that doesn't sound too ironic, in a movie called Of the Dead, tone that Snyder did in his superhero movies. It really is a lot more fun, I think, on the surface than Justice League or Man of Steel or Batman vs Superman. So with an absolute laser focus and I think an almost admirably like workmanlike quality, Snyder quickly gets right into the meat of the film. We set up the heist in the scene after the montage, so getting right into it, no need for normal life or whatever, and then we get into an assembling the team kind of heist section. Now what you want to do in a heist movie is have a team of recognizable characters who all have their own little quirks, their motivations, and importantly the skills that they're going to bring to the heist. And funnily enough, that's also what you want from a ensemble zombie or slasher film, because of course you want to set up the stakes for those characters to get picked off one by one. There's Van, who's this jacked dude who carries a buzzsaw to cut zombies in half, and there's Guzman, who is like a celebrity zombie killer, big on Reddit, as they say in the film. But for my money, the best two characters are Dieter, who is this German whiz kid who's going to crack the casino safe, and Peters, who is this ace helicopter pilot who's going to fly them out of Las Vegas. Now, Peters is an interesting case because actually she was originally played by another actor who was removed from the film because of sexual misconduct allegations. That means that every scene you see Peters in is either a reshoot or has a digitally inserted Tig Notaro in it. I've seen a few critics online saying that they've really noticed that and it's very jarring. I had the opposite experience where I was incredibly surprised that that was an addition to the film after its principal photography had wrapped. And it's not just because the effects are good, although I think they are. I think the reason why it really worked for me is that Tig Notaro is great in the film and really brings a strong flavour to the character that I've really enjoyed. She's basically taking all of the kind of deadpan humour that she's known for as a stand-up and turning it into this extremely laconic take on a pretty standard heist movie type, you know, the driver or the pilot. And I think it's just wonderful. Every scene she's in is so much fun. And the same is true of Dieter, who's played by a German actor called Mathias Schweighofer, and apparently Netflix like him enough that they've actually greenlit a prequel which may not even contain zombies in it. And that is a very low budget kind of rom-com heist comedy that apparently cost like a tiny amount in comparison to this movie. But after seeing it and seeing Dieter, I can't wait to see that film. It looks like a lot of fun. Now there are a few more characters like Scott, Dave Bautista's estranged daughter Kate, who works in a kind of refugee / quarantine camp outside the walls. And there's also a coyote, someone who takes them in and out of Las Vegas, called Lily. But they're all pretty forgettable, and luckily they just mostly serve as fodder for the film, which is kind of exactly what you want a forgettable character to do. So the team assemble and they wait in this refugee camp outside the walls. And when I say refugee camp, I mean it's like a quarantine area for people who used to live in Las Vegas. Although exactly why some of the main cast who were definitely in Las Vegas when it fell are able to not live there is not exactly clear. I'm not really sure how that works, and the film never really explains it, except that it maybe has something to do with money, which is kind of the main motivator for almost everyone in the film anyway. This refugee camp is part of, thankfully, a very limited and I think quite misguided attempt to tell a political story with the film as well. You hear a lot about this kind of idiotic president who wants to nuke Las Vegas as part of the 4th of July celebrations. And let's just say, you know, they're not subtle about implying who that is. They never confirm it exactly on screen, but the main candidate's former press secretary Sean Spicer appears very briefly in a cameo in the movie, so, you know, make your own minds up. Like I said, thankfully it's a brief part of the film because I don't actually think Zack Snyder has much to say about it. But it is funny to think that back when he wrote this film in the early noughties, he might have been talking about George Bush as his dumb president character. So that tells you, no matter what changes, some things always stay the same. And then with the team assembled, they head inside the walls. And this is where I'll stop and say I'm gonna go into spoiler territory. So if you don't want to know anything about the movie, then stop and go and take 2.5 hours to watch this 2-hour, 27-minute film, which gives you 3 minutes to make a coffee and then come back and watch this review. Okay, cool. When they come through the walls, which are these kind of shipping containers that have been set up to surround Las Vegas, they find thousands of kind of desiccated bodies and skeletons. And Lily tells them that this is the remains of the Shamblers. The Shamblers are kind of classic George Romero type slow-ish zombies, not intelligent, you have to destroy the brain, that kind of stuff. These are the zombies that the survivors would have been familiar with. But now it turns out that Las Vegas is actually pretty much run by the Alphas, who are these intelligent zombies who were directly bitten by the original Patient Zero zombie. He's gone and holed himself up in the Olympus casino, which turns out to be his kind of kingdom, and so the film and the characters call him Zeus. This to me is one of the most interesting ideas in the film, the idea of an actual zombie army, like complete with a leader zombie and everything. I think that's actually something that hasn't been seen that much. There is a series of sci-fi books that I read that has a kind of similar thing, but sort of more based off vampires, but this has a different mechanic to it, and I think it's a fun addition to this kind of zombie world-building lore. Now, they don't do much with it. I mean, they do enough to, you know, justify the concept and make the movie make sense, but I would like to see more exploration of that. So I am interested and kind of excited to see the purported anime sequel series that Netflix is making right now. Yeah, so this film has only just come out and already has a prequel and a sequel series. What are you going to do? This moment where they come into Las Vegas for the first time also really showcases the setting as a part of the film. And I think that's a really important thing that people sometimes forget about. You know, why is an outbreak in Las Vegas different from an outbreak in New York, an outbreak in LA, an outbreak in London, and so on and so forth? There's a kind of surreal dreamscape vibe to the city that mixes really well with the dreamy cinematography that we've talked about, because you have all of these miniature buildings dotted around the landscape, but they're all quite dilapidated and kind of shoved together. So it makes it a really odd setting and a very distinctive one, which really helps make the movie feel a bit more separate to the rest of the kind of zombie movies. The characters make it to the casino where they're going to go and raid the vault, and along the way have to kind of walk through this very crowded area of Shamblers who are hibernating. So these are zombies who you can avoid as long as you don't like shine a light in their eyes or make any loud noises. And of course, you know, you see all your characters going into a tight corridor like that and you immediately know where it's going to go, but it's a really fun set piece that I think is handled really well by Snyder and co. And then the movie just stops for about 40 minutes, which I think is probably the worst thing about the film. Kind of by design, because of the way the heist is laid out before you even start going into Las Vegas in the movie. You know they're going to have to stop and fix a helicopter that's on the roof and also crack the safe. Unfortunately, that does mean that there's about 40 minutes in the middle where people just stand around slowly fixing things and doing character development moments that don't really work terribly well. And that makes it all the more jarring when the very exciting final third starts up, with a quite literally head-turning moment. Now, I liked the final third of this film almost as much as I didn't like the middle third of the film, and that's because they do a number of really fun things to kind of rise up the tension and deliver this big finale. The first and most important thing is that they move up the nuke deadline, so instead of having a day to do the rest of the heist, they have about 90 minutes, which really ratchets up the tension. And the other thing is that Zeus, this alpha zombie, finally gets sick of them and sends his army towards them. It's here too that not only the action, but the gore of the film really ramps up. And I was pretty pleased to see this movie is very happy to do full gore. I feel like I've been burned too many times by these kind of neat PG to 15 zombie movies where you have a scary looking zombie, but it's just a clean headshot to the head, a little black dot in the middle of the head, and they're down, and that's that. This movie definitely isn't doing that. It's not only happy to use blood, but in fact to do the whole giblets thrown against a wall with like a paint bucket at a distance kind of blood. And it's not a realistic take on gore either. It's this kind of comic booky violence that's having fun with the idea of gore. You know, it's not enough for someone's head to get twisted off. You have to see their spine pop out of their shoulder, which I'm pretty sure can't happen, but is cool. So, valuable. And when the ending finally did roll around, I found it a little bit short, which is ironic for a film that's 2.5 hours long, which is, I think, slightly too long for a movie of this type, really. I could have done with maybe 5 more minutes at the end just to wrap up plot threads a bit more. And I suspect that the reason why that doesn't happen is because they wanted to leave open hooks for sequels, not just prequels and a kind of sequel or sideways anime series, but probably other films as well. I don't know if I'm just old-fashioned about this because I know that cinematic universes are the norm, not the exception now, but I like a movie to feel finished at the end, and that's something that I really didn't get from this, which is a shame. Still, it was a really enjoyable zombie movie that I think, despite its derivative kind of plot and character archetypes, brought some interesting ideas to zombie world building and lore, and also uses a distinctive visual and stylistic approach to tell a pretty fundamentally enjoyable zombie movie. And for me, that hit the spot. That was just about right. Most of all, I think my favourite things about the film is, firstly, that it has a much more light tone overall, or at least a more sort of irreverent tone than the occasionally very dour superhero stuff that Zack Snyder has done for the last decade. And secondly, I think the film really shows Snyder as someone who is by no means out of ideas. If anything, he's brimming with new approaches and concepts for stuff, even if it is fundamentally derivative plots that he's working on. So having watched this, I am interested to see what he does next. Which I always am, actually. I think he's a fundamentally interesting filmmaker, even though I also personally think that most of his movies are kind of bad. That's it from me, but as ever, I would love to hear what you thought about Army of the Dead. So let's have a chat in the comments below. How do you feel about the movie's visual style and plotting? What do you think about the potential to roll out into a bigger cinematic universe? Or would you rather see Snyder make more original content next? Really interested to hear your thoughts on this probably quite divisive movie. Have a good one, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.